Hi there. Welcome. My name is Javier de Janon, and I am the Director of Mass Defense at the National Lawyers Guild. I'm also a member of the People's Law Collective, and we are here today to talk about the Prairieland Antifa trial. I want to thank Defending Rights and Dissent for hosting this, for inviting me. I will be moderating this panel where we'll have a couple of speakers and I'll have some questions for them. We will have Chip Gibbons, who's the policy director at Defendant Rights and Dissent and the author of the forthcoming History of the FBI, the Imperial Bureau. We have Seth Stern, who's the chief of advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and Dario Sanchez, who is actually a state level defendant in the Prairieland cases. And as I mentioned, my name is Javier. I oversee the Mass Defense Program at the National Lawyers Guild. And before we get started, I wanted to give some overview about what we're talking about today. The Prairieland case made most mainstream news, unfortunately, only after a guilty verdict, after federal defendants in North Texas. And this guilty verdict came due to a noise demonstration. On July 4th, 2025, a group of people in North Texas gathered at a rally, at a noise demonstration to make noise against ICE and in solidarity with people inside of a detention center in North Texas. There was a clear call for a noise demonstration spread around Signal group chats. And so people showed up at nighttime, make noise. This was July 4th, and so fireworks were used to make noise, to capture the attention of the people inside, of immigrants who are caged inside of a detention center. And after the noise was made, people were feeling good. The ICE wardens came out, told people to leave, protesters left. Unfortunately, then Alvarado Police Department officer arrived, and Alvarado is the town where the detention center is in Texas. And as soon as that police officer got off his car, he pointed his firearm at protesters that started running once they saw the sirens and were trying to leave. And once after he pulled the firearm, shots were fired in his direction. He shot 3 times back, and then one of the bullets grazed the officer through the shoulder, or perhaps it was the back, perhaps it was the neck area. It was unclear. There's no medical records to date about these injuries, but it did not hit any organs. It was mostly superficial, and the officer was released from the hospital a couple hours later. Because of this incident with the fireworks, the federal government launched a massive investigation across North Texas at the federal level and at the state level in Johnson County. And to date, there are at least 19 defendants in both jurisdictions, federal and state. The government, during the trial and throughout the case, has referred to zines as evidence of crime, to signal messages as showing criminal intent, black clothing referred as tactical gear, and creating this imagined North Texas Antifa terror cell that to date has been shown does not exist. So since this all began, the National Lawyers Guild has been providing advocacy, and through the People's Law Collective, we've been able to be on the ground supporting the supporters and helping these cases as much as we can. And so today we're going to bring attention to these cases after the guilty verdict in federal court. And my hope is that as you all learn about this case, you find ways to plug in and support them, as they are setting a very dangerous precedent in this country. And so, to get us started, I want to start with, I think, one of our biggest panelists, which is Dario. Dario is currently facing state level charges, so he is a defendant right now. And so, Dario, I wanted to ask you if you can talk about this case, how it's impacted your life, and if you can, what are your reflections on this federal trial?
Sure. Yeah, I guess when it comes to the way that this has affected me, it's thrown my life completely into chaos. I mean, I am fortunate to be out of jail right now, to be out on bond, but even then I've had these kind of crazy restrictions placed on me to where, you know, my phone has this spyware on it. I have an ankle monitor. I have to go in for drug and alcohol testing. It's, it's changed the way I talk to my own friends, because some of these restrictions are things like, oh, I'm being monitored for gun violence, anti-government, and violence in general. So it was very broad and very vague. And I mean, given what's going on in the world right now, am I okay to criticize our government over what's going on right now in the world, or am I not? And frankly, I'd rather not find out. And as for my reflections on the federal trial, it really came as a shock to me. I mean, just being detached from it, not being able to go see it myself in person from what I saw in the news and from what I was hearing about it, it really seemed like there was quite a bit of reasonable doubt on a lot of these charges, and that verdict came as a shock, for sure.
And Dario, you mentioned that you are out of jail. What about the other Prairieland defendants?
Unfortunately, I'm the only one who is out on bond right now. There are other defendants that have state trials that have multi-million-dollar bonds the same way that I did previously. And it seems like the state is trying everything they can to slow down the process of appealing those decisions to keep those people in jail.
Thank you, Dario. And we'll come back to you. I want to now ask a question to Chip from Defending Rights and Dissent. Chip, we all know that the Trump administration has applauded this verdict as the first terrorism conviction for what they call Antifa. And this prosecution and this verdict follows Trump's executive orders and memoranda, which explained how the administration would target political dissent. Can you talk to us about Trump's Antifa executive order, also called in National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, and how those pave the way for this verdict and for this conviction?
Muted. I was asking if I was muted and you didn't respond because I was muted. Asking if you're muted when you're muted is very unuseful thing to do. But anyways, so Trump did two things in the run up to this. He issued an executive order declaring Antifa a terrorist organization, and then shortly after that he issued National Presidential Memorandum number 7. When the Trump Antifa executive order came out, there was a lot of question from people who have observed sort of political repression, Trump, and national security policy for a long time, whether this was a document of bluster or whether this was an actual blueprint to destroy Antifa. When people talk about designating an organization a terrorist organization, they typically think of the foreign terrorist organization designation that exists in the Immigration and Naturalization or Nationality Act. I always get that one wrong. Someone will correct me. That was added there by the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act, which essentially allows the Secretary of State to create a blacklist of foreign organizations that then makes it a crime to provide material support to. And material support can include, in some cases, political speech, if it is coordinated with them. Of course, they cannot take away your right to engage in independent political advocacy. There's also a second terrorism designation scheme based on the International Emergency Powers Act, which again is supposed to be international in nature, and functions much the same way. This sort of emergency powers framework is, of course, now being expanded to target human rights groups, as well as United Nations officials and International Criminal Court judges, which just shows how escalating this is. There is no equivalent designation for a domestic organization, which some people said, well, that makes the organization, that makes it sort of meaningless. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, historically, the Attorney General had a list of subversive organizations that was based a little bit off of the Hatch Act, but the government can make lists. And the other thing that I think people need to pick up on is that it described Antifa as a militarist anarchist enterprise. The FBI internally has a category of investigations called terrorist enterprise investigations, and it divides those into different subcategories. One of those subcategories is terrorist enterprise anarchist. So what this was clearly, in my mind, doing was communicating to the FBI to pursue groups that were dubbed Antifa, and we can discuss what that is or is not, if that, even as a term as a defined meaning, as anarchist enterprises, which is a way they prosecute people. NSPM 7 sort of lays out a strategy to attack the left using the pre-existing counterterrorism structure that really escalated and ossified after 9/11, but goes back well before 9/11, and in many ways starts to be developed as a way to undermine the post-Watergate reforms that sort of limited the McCarthy Cold War era political repression, because Nixon had gone too far. He went after his Democrats as opposed to just anti-war and socialist and communist as other presidents had done. And there's a sort of a plot to sort of undo those using this claim of terrorism that goes way back to the 70s, but really becomes the mainstay after 9/11. And, this outlines pretty much, it sort of brings the post 9/11 counterterrorism policing back to its McCarthyite roots. But what both documents do is they put a target on the back of people with these political opinions, because it is telling the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces include not just FBI agents, but local police who are deputized to act as what's called task force officers, that these are the bad guys you have to go after. People with anarchist views, people with extreme views on gender, whatever that is, people with un-American views, sort of, all of that sort of thing. And it's worth pointing out that since 2008, FBI guidelines, which if you're a local police officer in a task force, you operate under, even if those guidelines violate your state or local law, which they almost always certainly do because they are so low, has adopted this preventative intelligence model where there's a very low threshold for spying on people, because you're supposed to be proactively finding the terrorist. And then you're told the terrorist is someone who is extreme on gender. So now you have the sheriff of Idaho told to find someone who's a terrorist, and that person has an extreme view on gender. They're interpreting that and gives them incredibly expansive powers. In the Prairieland case, though, we went beyond just surveillance, which is very pernicious, and mostly what we deal with, into sort of the manipulation and hijacking of the legal process into basically lawfare against opponents of the administration, bringing these sort of fraudulent charges through twisted legal logic, which is a very disturbing escalation. But, go back to your question, the EO and the memorandum set the stage by putting targets on people's backs. The low-level FBI agents, the low-level task force officers know that to appease Trump and Miller, they need to sort of, bring them enemies, and they know who they are, and they, I guess in this case, succeeded.
Thank you, Chip, for providing that context. And we'll get back to you in a bit to follow up on more of the history of this. It's not the first time it's happened, as you mentioned. But I wanted to turn now to Seth, who I'm really excited is here, because one aspect of the Prairieland cases that hasn't got that much attention is the fact that throughout the federal trial, and even before in the indictments, the prosecutors repeatedly use what they called, quote unquote, radical zines, we would just call zines, as evidence of crime against the defendants. As a part of Freedom of the Press Foundation, what do you think are the implications of this prosecution for the freedom of the press?
Yeah, well, not only were zines used as evidence, but one person, Daniel Sanchez Estrada, who wasn't even at the protest in question, was convicted solely for transporting zines on the theory that those zines otherwise could have been used as evidence against his wife, who was at the protest, and he was concealing them. So zines were very much at the center of this prosecution. I think the first thing that we need to get straight to even start to analyze the First Amendment implications of the case is that the First Amendment protections for anti-government speech, for controversial or so-called radical speech, are not any weaker than the First Amendment protections for any other speech. In fact, that's kind of the whole point of free speech. You can go to the most repressive society on earth and say what the government wants you to say, and you won't have any problems because nobody is trying to repress you from saying what the government wants you to say. The reason we have this constitutional right is to say things the government does not want you to say. And when you look at the origins of the First Amendment, the founders were, for all of their very serious flaws, they were revolutionaries. They were insurrectionists, and they wrote literature that reflected that. The press of the time was highly politicized, highly adversarial. The founders themselves contributed to those outlets. The writings that the Press Freedom Clause was intended to protect probably bear a closer resemblance to the zines that Daniel Sanchez was convicted for transporting than to what you might read in the Associated Press or the New York Times. So this is really core free speech we're talking about. And this isn't intended as any sort of endorsement of everything the founders did. But one thing you can say about them is, but for example, slaves who got redacted versions of the Bible precisely because the belief was that the Exodus story might inspire an uprising, putting that aside, the founders more generally were not looking to suppress revolutionary literature. Their idea was that a future revolution would be prevented not through censorship, but through governance that would be good enough to keep the people from wanting to rebel. Our current government does not have that much confidence in its policies and itself, apparently. We see that now. So this whole notion of prosecution of anarchist zines, of radical literature is very much un-American. And when you look at the Sanchez case specifically, he is accused and convicted of transporting or concealing evidence of criminality. What's the criminality? Possession of zines. Now, did these zines say anything about the core crime that they were purported to evidence? Was there a manual in terms of what to do at this July 4th protest? Any violent acts to carry out? Any crimes to carry out at this July 4th protest? No, of course not. These were political essays that had nothing to do with that particular incident. They were entirely irrelevant to anything other than the beliefs in the defendants' heads, their political philosophies. So we're not looking at prosecuting terrorism or anything resembling terrorism. We're looking at prosecuting ideology, plain and simple. And that is that's what this case stands for. And the government isn't really looking to hide that. It's sort of out in the open. It was attempted at the state level in the Cop City case in Atlanta, where 61 people were indicted based on far-fetched, convoluted connections to the few who allegedly committed actual crimes, including distributing zines, talking to the press, essentially believing in anti-government ideas. That prosecution failed. But like so many other things that started at the local level, what we're seeing in this administration is that these bad ideas that were laughed at when they were attempted by small town sheriffs or local prosecutors have now become the official policy of the Trump administration. We saw it with Priscilla Villarreal. She was prosecuted in Texas, in Laredo, Texas, for asking police officers questions. The case was dropped. Everyone joked about it. It was ridiculous. It was this sort of Reno 9/11 scenario that nobody took too seriously. Now that's the position of the Pentagon. It's illegal to ask questions for non-public information. We saw, just yesterday, Trump tweets something purporting to order journalists to take down a news report he didn't like. That happened in Clarksdale, Mississippi last year. Again, it was quickly dropped, dismissed, laughed at. Everyone shook their heads. Oh, what are those? These Mississippi people? Kind of a joke. Nobody ever expected it to go mainstream. Now it's the president. So the one lesson we can learn for this when it comes to First Amendment violations is the states really are, the laboratory where these really dangerous theories are dreamed up and attempted. And it's a matter of time before that, wonky joke of a case happening in rural America somewhere becomes official federal policy.
Definitely, Seth. And I think, witnessing parts of the federal trial, it seemed that, every officer who handled evidence pointed to a pamphlet, to a brochure, to a zine, to something printed with political beliefs. And, part of what is concerning, as you mentioned, is that there's also a prosecution in this case of a book club, of a rifle association, of a DIY printing press. Yes, and the list goes on. But and I'll come back to you about further about the freedom of the press. But I wanted to follow up with Dario on the ruling itself and really the broader case. The purpose of this ruling, as Seth and Chip have mentioned, seems to be not just to punish defendants or punish people, but also to make an example of them. And it seems that with like other political prosecutions is to deter activism, right? Deter anti-government speech, deter criticism and activism, especially as ICE abuses expand across the country. I guess, Dario, I wonder if you can share how these cases have affected the political or organizing scene in North Texas, right? What has been, if there's any chilling effect, and how has activism changed in North Texas?
Yeah, I definitely feel it's a mixed bag. Certainly, there are people that I know who have decided that they'd rather just stay home right now, right? There are people who, even when it comes to simple things like passing out harm reduction supplies in our queer neighborhoods here in North Texas, like even that they were still worried that they might be targeted. So there has been a chilling effect to some extent, but on the other hand, I do feel like because of the organizing around this case, that there has been some kind of back and forth there, where there are still people who are deciding that they now is the time for them to speak up about these sorts of things, because it's very clear that Prairieland is just a blueprint, and that this is a tactic that's going to be used on other people, regardless of what kind of protest they might be a part of.
Yeah, and definitely often with these political prosecutions, right, that's the goal, to silence. I guess, even traveling a bit more in the past with how much you can share. What was the vibe right after July 4th, right, when the raids were happening? Because I think that is part of a political prosecution and investigation, right, to make people scared and silence. You mentioned there's more organizing now, but what was the vibe back then, July 2025?
Certainly, I remember people being terribly scared. Like, I myself didn't really know what was going on. I was trying to figure out what had actually happened, and there were really no answers. So a lot of people freaked out and just dropped off the face of the earth. There are still some people who I wonder how they're doing, because I just haven't heard from them in such a long time.
Yeah, and it makes sense that the way that the government was raiding and really kidnapping people in Texas was terrifying. And I think, going back to Chip, because we are in another moment in history, right? We're not just suddenly in this situation. Even though this is the first guilty verdict of this kind, right, of the Antifa flavor, we could say, we know that U.S. repression of political activism is nothing new. And you mentioned some examples of the FBI having other kinds of investigations and other kinds of lists. I'm wondering, is what's happening right now under the Trump administration different from the past? Is it an escalation, or is this just business as usual?
I think it's an escalation. It's definitely not something new. And if you notice, Trump has not passed any new laws. We don't have a Smith Act. That's the 1930s law that became very important during the Cold War. We don't have a Patriot Act that was passed. We don't have an Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act that was passed. He is using old laws and old structures. And a lot of the reason he's able to do what he's doing is because the national security state existed in such a way to give the executive branch these powers. So NSPM 7, he talks all about using various counterterrorism structures that already exist. He talks about using the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, which has pursued anarchists and all kinds of other people for a long time. He talks about the preventative framework. The preventative framework has been the door for political surveillance in this country since the 1970s. Again, I mentioned the sort of reaction post-Watergate, the sort of the McCarthy, Hoover, whatever you want to call it, Cold War type surveillance, where the FBI was spying on first what they called subversives, and then later they added an extremist. What's an extremist? What's a subversive? You know, that's an interesting question. But after that point, they were sort of told you can't do this anymore, and they start to say, okay, we're not spying on political views. We're spying on people in order to prevent violations of particular statutes. And as soon as the Church Committee report comes out, Barry Goldwater, in his dissent, says we won't be able to prevent terrorism if we limit FBI surveillance. Very few people were thinking about preventing terrorism in 1975, but there's this steady drumbeat, first from the Heritage Foundation, then from the Reagan administration, then from these sort of various Senate subcommittees that again and again attacked the post-Watergate reform, saying that when you stop the FBI from spying on people, unless they're agents of a foreign power or committing a crime, we can't prevent terrorism because terrorism is a political crime and terrorists come out of political movements and political movements automatically give birth to terrorism. Therefore, we have to preventively spy on politics. And this existed as this sort of revanchist McCarthyite position. And then post 9/11, what do John Ashcroft and Robert Mueller come out and say? The FBI is no longer a law enforcement agency that prosecutes terrorism after the fact, but an intelligence agency that prevents it before it occurs. They strip it of the open McCarthyite aspirations of it. But as we now see with Trump talking about preventing, a preventative approach to Antifa, it's come full circle. And, it's worth pointing out that the FBI put forward a counterterrorism strategy for both domestic and international terrorism. And I think it was 2009, they called it a disruption strategy. Of course, disruption was the language of counterintelligence program. Disruption is the language of NSPM 7. It's a lot of things. The FBI loves disruption. And the other thing that we're seeing now is that we're increasingly seeing tools that were introduced to fight international terrorism. And international terrorism frequently means domestic political speech, historically, right? If you were against Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, if you are a Palestinian who thinks Palestinians are human beings and have rights, you were targeted as an international terrorist, even if you were a U.S. citizen engaging in political speech in the U.S., because the constitutional protections and restrictions in international terrorism were less than domestic terrorism. Well, what we're seeing now is the increased desire to take concepts from the international terrorism sphere, like lists of terrorism designations, like attacks on so-called financing and things of that nature, and applying them domestically. So we've accepted, I didn't accept, but we as society accepted, okay, international terrorism, less protections, more surveillance, because it's about foreigners. Oh, wait, it's about Americans, but they're international terrorists. Oh, wait, let's then move that to domestic terrorists because they're terrorists too. So we see this sort of expansion of existing national security policies, as well as just the use of them. So this is very much an escalation. And I must note, when Trump became president, the United States was in the worst crisis for freedom of speech since the post 9/11 era. Now, he's taken us back to the McCarthy era or the Red Scare, but we were in a crisis for free speech because of the crackdown on pro-Palestinian speech, which was largely through fake allegations of anti-Semitism, fake allegations of terrorism, and just wanton brutality, as we witnessed against these students. And because of this Palestine exception to the First Amendment that has festered for far too long, Trump was able to take that and build on that and sort of take us to a sort of a general exception to the First Amendment. So I do not think we can talk about Trump's political repression without remembering the bipartisan attacks on Palestinian supporters and Palestinian human rights activists. And I say that as Israel today has just assassinated another journalist in Gaza and is carrying out some of the most sickening acts of aggression in downtown Beirut that I've witnessed yet. So we have to remember he is building off of the national security policy. He is building off of a McCarthyite legacy of counterterrorism, and he is building off of the Palestinian exception to First Amendment to sort of escalate us from a sort of post 9/11 type free speech crisis into a McCarthy era type free speech crisis. And I don't think he's done yet. Who knows how far he takes us if we don't stop it. And I mean stopping it peacefully and lawfully through protest and getting Congress to do their job, not anything else. Please don't put me on the list for saying that. I meant
No worry, you're in good company, Chip. I think
I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid I'm already on a list.
We're in the best company. And something too, Chip, you mentioned, which came by Seth with the chronology with the Cop City movement and the Stop Cop City prosecutions. People forget, and I get asked often, that this happened in one of the bluest cities of the South, bluest counties of the South, under a Democrat mayor, under the Democrat Biden administration. That was when the Stop Cop City prosecutions really spun out of control. And now, right, like you mentioned, the platter was given to a federal administration that is extremely conservative and extremely red, some people would say. I'm going to turn to Seth with another question, but before we move on, Chip, something that you already kind of brought up was other examples of these, so-called extremists or identity extremists. And because often what I've heard, right, is people say, well, I'm not Antifa, right? I'm not someone who believes in anarchism. I'm not a gender extremist. But I'm wondering if you could give other examples, from the past decades or even right now, that might challenge people in that their beliefs might come next or have already come.
Well, I mean, so the FBI has sort of a bifurcated counterterrorism structure. It does international terrorism, which is traditionally linked to support for a foreign terrorist organization or what's called a homegrown violent extremist. This means being Muslim. That's basically what it means. Homegrown violent extremists are people who are born in the U.S., oftentimes born here, self-radicalized in the U.S., whatever that means, but were radicalized by an international organization. So if you're a domestic terrorist who is Muslim, we say you're an international terrorist. In the domestic terrorism side of things, they police things through what they call persistent extremist movements. The FBI has sort of, in the last Trump administration and continuing through Biden, sort of warped the definitions of persistent extremist movements, sort of combining different categories together to hide what they're spying on. So anarchist, Puerto Ricans, the FBI recognizes Puerto Rican extremists, the DHS does not. It's always fascinating in the DHS FBI joint documents. There's like a little footnote like, Puerto Rican extremists are recognized by the FBI, but not by the DHS. So they combine together Puerto Ricans, anarchists, sovereign citizens, and militias into a group called anti-government, anti-authority extremists. They combine together what they used to call black extremists and white extremists into racially motivated violent extremists. But internally, as far as we can tell, the FBI still uses the old categories. So what is an anarchist extremist? It is somebody who opposes racial, social, political hierarchies, corporate globalization, or capitalism. It's fascinating because the definition is still very much influenced by the 1999 Seattle protest movement, which is where I think a lot of it was defined. So the FBI is saying, if you don't like corporate globalization, which is a very nebulous term, I think most people probably don't like that unless they work for like Nike or Goldman Sachs. If you oppose racial, social, I think it's actually unjust. If you oppose unjust racial, social hierarchies, you have the views that leads one to become an extremist. Violent extremist. Same with Black identity extremists or Black extremists. Or I think now it's people motivated by a prophetic, political, or religious teaching in a Black homeland, whatever that means. It comes back to perceptions of police brutality, perceptions of police violence. So we're defining the threat by an ideology. And when you start with that ideology, then you open the door to being spied on in this sort of pre-crime preventative notion. On top of that, the FBI is of the persuasion that political protest causes violence. I uncovered while writing my book an FBI document from August 2001, less than a month from the worst and most horrific violent terrorist attack in this country's history, where the FBI is saying the big terror threat is anarchists, the people we're talking about today. And, they have a number of reasons why they think this. First of all, the anarchists have already assassinated President McKinley. That is 100 years before this document, but okay, FBI, assassination of President McKinley, you go respond to that. But they also say because the World Trade Organization protest or a watershed protest, terrorism is likely to come because watershed protests always lead to terrorism. And during the Bush years, the FBI introduced 2 bulletins on the signs of protest, encouraging JTTFs to spy on them and look for signs of protest and monitor them for potential terrorism. This upset the Inspector General so much, he wrote to the Office of Legal Counsel, and the Office of Legal Counsel said this is totally constitutional, this is totally okay. Even though you're, monitoring speech, which is what you're doing, you're actually not monitoring speech. You're looking for potential violations of civil unrest statutes, which counts as terrorism. So we have adopted a pre-crime preventative framework in which political activity that is protected by the First Amendment, and it's subjective whether something is extreme or radical or not. I'm not going to play that game, is the first step to becoming an extremist or a terrorist, or whatever the word du jour is. And therefore we start spying there.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, Chip, why this federal government was so quick at calling someone who was killed, like Alex Preddy or Renee Nicole Good, terrorists, right? Because they have this framework where a First Amendment protected activity that's political would amount to, eventually they'd say terrorism. But so thank you, Chip. I want to now turn to Seth. With all that we've heard from on the ground from Dario, from a historical and analytical perspective from Chip, for you, how does this moment or these efforts of the U.S. government infringe on the freedom of the press? You mentioned some of it already, but where does this ruling and this moment fit in the broader context of the freedom of the press?
It's really being overlooked in that conversation. Press freedom violations by the current federal administration are getting a decent amount of attention. I don't know about enough attention, but a decent amount. That said, most of the attention is focused on attacks on the mainstream media, on CNN, on the New York Times, the Pentagon Press Pool, the White House Press Association, so on and so forth. And those attacks are important, but there is a next step to the campaign to silence and rein in the U.S. media beyond corporate media. And some might be of the mind that, well, Trump is only concerned with corporate media because That's what he's most aware of. That's what makes the biggest headlines. He's sort of a product of 1980s Manhattan. So when he thinks the media, he thinks the New York Times and, CBS News. Maybe that's the case, but I fear it's not. I fear that corporate media is step one. And after that comes independent media, nonprofit media, and speech that might not typically be considered in the common language media at all. Communications and organizing, zines, which are certainly, as I said, based on the founder's conception of what the press is, press, but not usually what people these days think of. The corporate media, already is kind of not great and hasn't been for a while for any number of reasons. So if you're looking to sort of make lemonade out of the situation, you might think, well, Trump's going to destroy the corporate media and make it so non-credible that nobody tunes in anymore. And then there's going to be this sort of uprising of great independent, shoe leather journalists who are what the press was supposed to be before it became corporate media, and we're going to destroy and rebuild, and in the future we're going to have something better. That's sort of the idealist vision of where this all goes. I mean, that vision doesn't work if the independent press is also kneecapped. And when you start looking at these attacks on ideologies, as Chip was describing, the independent press tends to be more ideological, a little bit more, quote unquote, radical, anti-establishment. So it's not really that far from what we're seeing in the Prairieland case to get to a point where a news outlet, let's say a nonprofit news outlet that reports critically about Israel, let's say, is declared to be a supporter of terrorism and has their tax exempt status, rescinded. That's something that several members of Congress advocated for during the Biden administration, when the Associated Press and other outlets were purchasing photographs from Palestinian journalists. So, and from there you get to a point where, well, is this news outlet providing material support to Antifa by lending a platform to the nebulous ideological elements that are defined to encompass domestic extremism, as Chip described? So we're not as far away from those scenarios as we might think. And the other component of this case, and particularly Daniel Sanchez's prosecution, that is concerning to me is the idea that you can punish possession or transportation of news when you can't punish reporting of news. That is a theory that we have seen sort of experimented with in several ways over the years. And you were talking about how this is not solely a red state issue. Look at the state of California. There was an attempt made, fortunately it didn't go anywhere, by the LA Sheriff's Department to investigate and potentially prosecute an LA Times journalist for merely possessing police records. Another journalist was actually sued by the city of Los Angeles for not giving back police mugshots that the department had released to him pursuant to his public records request after he had to sue to get those documents. Let's say in Florida, there's a journalist named Tim Burke who has been prosecuted, who is currently being prosecuted, started with the Biden administration, still happening now, for finding information that was openly available with a little bit of tech savvy on the internet at an unencrypted public URL for possessing it. He couldn't be restrained from reporting it, but the prosecution is essentially going after him for receiving it. And it goes on both sides politically. During the Biden administration, Project Veritas, which I am not in any way defending their journalistic output or anything that they do, but they were investigated for possessing Ashley Biden's diary, which they obtained lawfully. Whether you think they should have been reporting on it or not, as an ethical matter, they obtained it lawfully. In the past, journalists have been allowed to publish information they obtained lawfully. If someone broke the law to get it to them in the first place, that's a separate matter. But the journalist is entitled to publish. That wasn't so much the case. So, there have been and Chip in the chat mentioned the Palestine Chronicle. Another example of a publication targeted merely for its ideological perspective, a nonprofit status. That is a weapon that Trump has alluded to wielding, hasn't gone super far with it yet. I think kind of had a false start because he made the unwise decision to first target Harvard, the most wealthy and lawyered up nonprofit he could find, as opposed to starting small. But, as we see these things that Trump is fixated on that sort of fall into the background, like, stealing Greenland, or maybe next it is revoking tax-exempt status of nonprofits he doesn't like. These things can still certainly happen. So this idea that possessing or transporting news is a workaround for the constitutional prohibition on punishing truthful information is really concerning. It can affect activists like Daniel Sanchez. It can affect independent nonprofit journalists like the Palestine Chronicle, and it can affect national security reporters. The Espionage Act, taken literally, would allow for the prosecution of national security reporters for simply possessing defense information. My view is that interpretation would be unconstitutional. Past administrations generally, with the subject to the Assange exception, have not wanted to test that, both probably for fear of losing the court case and for fear of political backlash. There's an understanding that prosecuting journalists for publishing government secrets is kind of un-American, and people aren't going to like that. But Trump would love nothing more than to change those norms and test out those theories and bring them to his highly compromised Supreme Court for a final determination. And when you start normalizing the notion that journalists can be punished for merely possessing news, or that anyone can be published for merely possessing literature or information, it's one step closer to breaking down those sort of political barriers to crossing that red line and prosecuting a journalist for merely possessing and reporting leaks, reporting on the same kind of reporting that Trump has been threatening for the last several months. I think we're on the verge. I fully expect one day during this administration to find out that a journalist is being prosecuted for very routine national security reporting for obtaining documents from sources. And I think cases like Daniel Sanchez's are sort of building blocks towards that moment.
Yeah, and Seth, something that you mentioned about this march, right, towards fascism, this march towards the erosion and destruction of freedoms. On the flip side, something that I noticed in the Prairieland case reporting, well, other than almost no reporting originally, was that many outlets regurgitated what seemed to be federal government talking points. And, the words ambush, attack, attempted murder, coordinated attack were repeated by outlets, local, national, even international, even though we all knew and we saw during the trial, none of this happened. I guess, just briefly, if you can comment on that flip side, right, on the federal government, does it have its own media machine? Does it have its own propaganda machine, even though it's supposed to be trying to get rid of the corporate machine?
Yes. At Freedom of the Press Foundation, we defend the rights of journalists in hopes that when equipped with those rights, they will do a good job and produce good, thorough, in-depth adversarial reporting. But they don't always. Too often they don't. And that's certainly an example, just like we see in international reporting that the government line is prioritized over foreign adversaries. No matter how many times our government is exposed as liars, it continues to get quoted, shape the framing of stories, while adversaries are not given similar opportunities. We see the same thing day to day when it comes to not only reporting on Antifa and so-called domestic terrorism, but on crime. The cops often, almost always, dictate the framing of that reporting in much of the mainstream media. And that is based on any number of factors. Obviously, reporters, like anyone else, are looking to finish their work and go home. And the easiest way to finish your work and go home is to essentially let the government's press release frame your story, get one quote to the contrary to make it look two-sided, and be done with it. So to some extent, laziness is a factor. There's also just lack of access, though. You've got to get words on paper or your editor is going to be pissed off. And when FOIA doesn't work, you submit public records requests, get no response for months and years at a time, or get bogus denials when all of your inquiries are routed to a public information officer, a PR flap, rather than anyone who actually knows what they're talking about. And lastly, when your sources are inside the police department, your sources are inside the government. Those are the people you talk to every day, and you can get them on the phone easily. It's a lot harder to go get Dario on the phone if you've never dealt with him before. So I'm not excusing it. I'm just trying to explain sort of all of these baked in elements that lead to the deference to law enforcement, the unearned deference to law enforcement that you do often see in the press. And when it comes down to it, journalists need to do a better job. That should not be the way the news reads, particularly during these times when the government's lack of credibility is so glaringly obvious. Not that the government has ever been particularly credible in what it tells the press, but now it's just unavoidable that government sources are untrustworthy, and they're not entitled to really any deference. But old habits are hard to break, and the press does sometimes fall back on old habits, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. Yeah, and I think even right after the verdict, the federal government had a press release. The Department of Justice did, with so many untruths, and speaking of a terror cell that doesn't exist, was not proven at trial. But thank you so much, Seth and Chip. I'm going to close this off with Dario, who is still a defendant in these massive Prairieland cases. I want to know, or if you can share, right, like what comes next for your case, for the broader cases, and if you can talk about the federal sentencing, federal appeals, with what you can share.
Sure. Yeah, as far as my case goes, we've still got a chance at dismissal right now, just because the charges against me and the indictment written against me are pretty flawed. My lawyers have been pretty clear about that. They've got a brief in support of their motion to quash the case, how the charges against me are about physical evidence, and physical does not mean digital, and how just to clear that up for any listeners, I'm accused of removing someone from a group chat, and that means that I somehow tampered with evidence, tampered with physical evidence, and hindered the prosecution of terrorism. right? And that's a state law in Texas. So the brief is pretty much laying out just the ways in which these charges are flawed against me, and that they really don't make any sense. And the prosecution has until the 10th of this month to respond. So we're hopeful. I mean, at the hearing where we talked about this motion, my lawyers presented their evidence, their citations of case law, and the prosecution just said, well, sometimes physical does mean digital. And that was it. Does look like my trial is going to be pushed back at this point. So that is a bit frustrating. But in the end, I'm still feeling pretty confident, just because I fundamentally did not commit a crime. I didn't alter or destroy any information. And as my lawyers have said, even if I had, I certainly didn't do it in a county that I've never been to in my entire life.
For sure. Can you share about the federal cases or what you know?
Yeah, I understand that right now the federal defendants, they've moved for a retrial, and that they're also making preparations for an appeal. It was reported recently that there was some kind of commotion inside the jury room before the verdict came out, and there's some questions about what exactly happened there, particularly because right when the verdict came out, our local news reported that two of the jurors were crying when the verdict was read in court. So it definitely seems like there's even more weird inconsistencies that have happened in this federal trial, even after all the other things that have happened. So I'm really hoping that that justice can actually be served, because it's clear to me that all these people have just been railroaded this whole way through.
Yes, and speaking, beyond the jury room and all of that got revealed, I also heard and read that, there's even FBI reports and records that weren't handed over from 2018, 2019 investigation. Yes, I guess, a final question I have for Dario, and then I'll wrap us up, is, if you could tell people who maybe aren't in North Texas, just learning about the case, what would be helpful, I suppose, for the Prairieland defendants. What is very helpful for them?
Yeah, I guess obviously there is a fundraiser on the website to help with the cost of appeals lawyers, to help with getting through this process, because it is going to be, at this point, it's looking to be a years-long process of appeals, and that's not cheap, unfortunately. And then, of course, we still need lawyers at the state level, because a lot of these public defenders have shown themselves to be extremely unprofessional, unfortunately. Just it's real disappointing. But yeah, beyond that, just talking about the case with people, hosting events, whether that's letter writings for the defendants that are still held in custody. I know for myself, I spent 36 days in solitary confinement, and towards the end of that, I started to receive letters from people, across the country, and it really helped to keep me sane in those moments where it was starting to look like I might have to spend quite a lot more time in there. So letter writing, donations to the fundraiser, any events in solidarity that people want to host. If they want to read some of the zines that were discussed in the trial, that's another thing that people have been encouraging, because this is free speech material. It is not illegal. At least we hope it'll stay that way.
Yes, for sure. And, for those tuning in, prairielanddefendants.com has all the information for letter writing and for donating and for events you can host and ideas. I want to thank Chip, Seth, and of course Dario for being here. And I hope that folks around the country, people tuning in, tell a friend that what is happening in North Texas could happen to your organizing scene, your political scene, your printing of zines and pamphlets and handouts. And yes, and I hope that people continue to organize and stand up against this government, because that is the way that societies overcome fascism. So yes, thank you to our panelists. Thank you everyone who's tuning in.